Witch Podcast, the show where we do a little ranting, raving, and wand waving. I'm your host, Paige Vanderbeck, and together we're going to explore magic and spirituality, social justice, the psychic realm, and truly modern witchcraft. Hello again, my witchy friends, and thank you for tuning in to the Fat Feminist Witch. Next week, summer officially ends with the Autumn Equinox on September 22nd, though you'd never guess that with the weather here, because it is sweltering. I love heat, but I'm so ready for it to cool off already. The Autumn Equinox is the second of 3 back-to-back harvest festivals on the pagan calendar, beginning with Lunasa on August 1st, and ending with Halloween on the 31st, or sometimes November 1st. A lot of witches, myself included, celebrate the autumn equinox a lot like a North American Thanksgiving. So you've got a big seasonal meal and there's a focus on gratitude and abundance. You might even do the whole thing where you go around the table and say what you're thankful for. For the equinox, we look at what we've harvested this year, either literally or metaphorically, and we give thanks for what we've got. It's also a good time to share that abundance with other people. We call these days the equinox because the sun sits right above the equator, which makes the night and the day pretty much of equal length. And then afterwards, the days grow shorter and shorter pretty rapidly. In the southern hemisphere, this is actually the spring equinox, so the reverse is true. It's a time of balance. Everyone on the planet is experiencing this moment of equal day and night. And then we part in opposite directions, but we make the same kind of journey, which I think is very interesting. So it's a happy time full of tasty food and for sharing in the bounty of, the earth and our hard work. But that's really only one side of the coin. The flip side of abundance and gratitude is loss and grief. We are harvesting right now, but that means that growth is about to stop for a time because it's a cycle. A really popular myth or folktale associated with this time of year is that of Persephone and Demeter. Demeter is the goddess of agriculture and crops, and her daughter Persephone is the goddess of springtime flowers. One day Persephone is taken to the underworld to become the bride of Hades, the god of the dead, and no one can find her. Demeter searches everywhere that she can get to, and she can't find her anywhere, and so in her grief she neglects her duties, and crops start to wither and people start going without food. Persephone is eventually found by Hecate, and she's about to be returned to the surface, but it turns out that she's eaten seeds from the pomegranate, which is the food of the dead, and so she can't just leave. Zeus decides that she will stay in the underworld and serve as its queen for half of the year, and return to her mother for the other half. When Persephone is home, Demeter is happy and fulfills all of her divine duties, and the crops flourish. And when she's grieving, the crops die back, because sometimes grief is just so big that it becomes a full-time job until we can find the energy and the motivation to do other things. So grief has always been a part of the story of the autumn equinox. Demeter grieves her daughter while she's missing, and again during her 6-month periods away. But Persephone grieves too. She says goodbye to a way of life, an identity, a job, a relationship. She gains something new, but that doesn't completely replace what she's left behind. It doesn't make it not matter anymore. She also had, some vision of her future, I'm sure, something that lived entirely in the realm of possibility, but that doesn't mean it didn't feel real. Grief is very abstract, it's very individual, and yet also totally universal. Just like the type of balance that comes with the equinox, grief is something we all experience, though we don't always move forward in the same direction or at the same time. So joining me today to talk about the ways that we can support ourselves and others through grief is Courtney Weber, who's been on the show before and of whom I am a huge fan. She's one of the hosts of That Witch Life and the author of plenty of witchy books, including Hecate, which I've talked about a lot this year. And she's recently released a book called Sacred Tears, A Witch's Guide to Grief. Sacred Tears is both a personal account of her journey through grief and also a guide to help you find ways through it with spirituality, or to practice your spirituality in the wake of grief, which can often change how that works. It's not an instruction manual with a nice, clean, and easy recipe for getting rid of grief. Wouldn't that be beautiful? But what the book is a very heartfelt and caring book filled with support and with understanding. I found it super relatable and really helpful even though Courtney and I were going through very different things. A big theme in this book is Courtney's issues with fertility and pregnancy loss. And we also discussed that a little bit in the interview you're about to hear. This can be a really painful subject, so I just wanted to give you the heads up before you dive in. But that is a major theme throughout the book of Sacred Tears. And that's not an experience I have. That's not something I have any personal experience with. And despite that, I found that a lot of her, the feelings that she was going through in the aftermath of a difficult situation, a lot of the feelings she had, especially in relation to her spirituality, were just like ones that I had when I was dealing with something very, very different. So it's a little heavy, but the good news here is that near the end of our conversation, our interview here, Courtney's little daughter can be heard like cooing and laughing and fussing around in the background, which is kind of a balm for the soul after reading some of the difficult things in the book. So I didn't edit very much of that little one out. I took some, but she's super cute and I like hearing her in the background, and I won't apologize for it, especially because sometimes the timing is really funny. Babies are nature's perfect comedians. And I couldn't help but smile while I was editing the episode, and you would hear this cute little like baby cooing or making a noise right after Courtney would mention like being distracted or beautiful things that come after periods of grief. So I hope you enjoy listening to, our special third hidden guest on this episode as much as I do. So let's jump in with Courtney Weber for a discussion about grief, with a potentially weird number of jokes and laughs sprinkled throughout, because Courtney is just such a delightful person to talk to, and I always love having her on the show, even when we talk about something very heavy. She brings such a good, happy energy to the show and to our conversation. So I hope it is the perfect listening for however you are spending this autumn equinox weekend. So thank you so much, Courtney, for being here with me today. I'm so excited to have you back on the show. It's been too long.
I'm so excited. I was thinking about that this morning when I was getting ready to meet with you. It's like we just have every time we've had you on our podcast, it's just been so much fun. So it's like, even though we haven't been in the same physical space before, it's just like, oh, it's Paige. It's going to be hilarious and the easiest thing ever. So yes, I'm delighted to see you.
Absolutely. That's so true. And all the time I think about how different it would be to like be on a podcast with other people. And I always think of you and your show with the other girls. I'm like, that is the dream. Like that's the pinnacle of having like a podcast with multiple people. Like what a good group to chat with. Like you guys are so much fun.
It is wonderful. It can also be maddening.
Oh, other people are the worst. So today the like number one reason that we're talking is to talk about Sacred Tears, A Witch's Guide to Grief, which I loved, by the way. Difficult to read, but like in a good way. Difficult to read, but in a good way, and it's something I have definitely needed to read recently. And actually, I read Hecate earlier this year, or reread it. I reread it because I'd read it before, but I reread it earlier this year because I needed it. I really needed it. And it was so helpful. Like it really, really helped me out. So you're doing it a second time here. So thank you so much. Grief is one of those things where it's such a it's simultaneously like a really universal experience and also so personal and
Yes.
so individual that it's just really difficult to like find support from anywhere. And when I first saw, the title of your book and the topic and everything, I tried to think, have I found any other books that are like this? Because
Mm-hmm.
now that you mention it, it's one of those things I've never seen.
Yeah.
Um, and you address that in the book, that you couldn't find spiritual resources for dealing with grief when you went through something um, difficult, and that's why you wrote the book. Did you ever find any other spiritual like sources of help to help you
I
get through
found
grief?
Yeah, I found little pieces along the way.
Yeah.
for that were I found very relatable. One was, oh gosh, what was it called? It was like, forget prayers, bring cake.
Yeah.
Like, and so that,
That's a real good, like, just
yeah,
right away, I'm like, yep, 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 that's
that was
it.
a lovely book. And so that one was very relatable for how, how ways to show up to help people when they're going through grief. Um, and I also, there were, I was where I was having just there was another book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, where I
Oh, that's a
really,
title.
yeah. And that was, I appreciated that book's approach to the frustration of the shortcomings of all of spirituality in general. This was written
Yeah.
by a Christian woman, and a very progressive Christian woman. So, and so she was not leaning into any of the God has a plan, which I would start reading books by, well-intended Christians that within a couple of chapters be like, but God has a plan. And I would just close the book and say,
Yeah.
well, this is God's plan. Fuck God,
Yeah, that's a fucked up
and
plan.
yeah, that's a fucked up plan. And whereas I appreciated Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved for that questioning some of those, you know, those things that people say, or just as kind of Instagram, Pinterest worthy,
Throw
statements.
pillow quotes, yeah.
Oh yeah, for cross stitch quotes,
Yeah.
but it's not. Um, I mean, for me, sometimes it's like, well, everything happens for a reason, and sometimes that reason is garbage. You
Yeah.
know, that's kind of where I so. But I still, there's I couldn't quite relate to her relationship with Jesus. I
Yeah.
mean, that was a relationship that I had to, I mean, I don't even know, like, even as a Christian, if I ever really had a relationship with Jesus, so to speak. Like when I
Yeah.
was growing up, it was always about angels and saints and Mary. I mean, things that
Yeah.
the symptoms of you
There was
will eventually
all those
become a
other
witch.
there was all those other folks,
Yeah, and I
right?
was like, or talking to the spirits of dead relatives,
Yeah.
and looking for fairies on the beach at Bible camp. I mean, all that kind of stuff. But I don't ever think I really ever had a relationship with Jesus, and
Yeah.
it just was never something that happened for me, and so it was not really something that I could really, especially follow in this wake of grief, where I'm having just a lot of major questions about you know the existence of these kinds of beings in general. I appreciate to a point some of the Buddhist teachings that I read, and I'm drawing a blank on some of the books that I read now, where it was the acceptance that some people say, like, well, life is suffering, and that can be really thwarted in a lot of ways, especially in in a lot of community circles, where they're like, well, that's just saying that people who are in poverty deserve to be in poverty, and that's not really what those teachings are saying. But
Yeah.
it's a matter of, well, not taking this life personally and
Yeah.
thinking that like, yeah, life involves suffering. It doesn't mean that the suffering shouldn't be addressed, or that you deserve the suffering, but it means that when the suffering happens, it removes that why me piece of
Yeah.
thing, which can
It's
really.
not something you necessarily caused, it's something that happens no matter what.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so and then also, it helps. I don't want to say skip steps, but sometimes I think we can really get caught up in our I'm so angry, why did this happen to me phase,
Yeah.
instead of, oh shoot, we may be interrupted here. I'm going to give her a
If you
couple
gotta go,
minutes.
that's totally
But we're going to
okay.
give her a couple minutes to see if she goes back to sleep, because she hasn't been in sleep for very long. But if she has, we may have to pause and stick her
That's okay.
with the pouch and
Yeah.
let her
That's
have a snack.
okay.
So that that was one of the bigger challenges, but some of those things I felt like were really important for witches to explore, and it's important to explore and say, hey, things are not happening to us because destiny necessarily ordained it. Um, and it's possible that the gods are not in control.
Yeah.
Um, and can we live with that? Like,
Yeah.
and is there even a point to having gods in our practices if they aren't in control? So that, I mean, when I was, and also I think one of the bigger things for me going through the loss that I went through and then having that crisis of faith,
Yeah.
because a crisis of faith is natural to having any sort of spiritual or religious beliefs whatsoever. And even in, my upbringing in Christianity, while they acknowledged crisis of faiths will happen, they treated it as an emergency problem to solve.
Yeah.
Like, you need to fix it. You've got, like, same thing, like you've got a leak in the foundation of your house. You need to call a plumber. You're questioning your faith. You need to fix that. You got to fix that right
Yeah.
away. Instead of recognizing it's not a leak in the foundation. It's part of the process, and that sometimes your having belief means you're not going to believe as much as you
Yeah.
did before. And in recognizing that those moments are uncomfortable, but that they're natural and they don't need to be fought. They don't need to be fixed. Loss does change our relationship with our beliefs, and that's
Yeah.
part of it. And some people have major crises of faith when they lose, and it's all of a sudden, was magic ever real? Was I ever even a witch? Was this all bullshit? Have I spent my life chasing a mirage? What's going on? And that's such a frustrating thing to think, especially when you're a public author who's written books on this and people are like, oh, your book changed my life. And you're like, great. I don't even know what my life is right now. I'm really happy though that you've got something. I don't know what to say. It's not the
I
case
had
for
this
everyone though.
exact experience last year. Like
Yeah.
you're describing exactly like my thought process last year. And it was like, I was like, oh great, all this other shit happened. And now this. And like, what the fuck? Like this
And
is
people are like, oh, but your work is changing lives. Awesome. So glad to hear it.
cool.
Yeah. Yay.
Glad
Good
it's
for
changing
you.
everyone else's life. Yeah.
But yeah. Um, and this is like such a strange thing to bring up, but I think it's important is that, and I'm not a fan of Mother Teresa. Let me just say that up front. I don't
Problematic,
like,
to
yeah,
say the
she was,
least.
I see her as an emblem of a problematic system. I don't like
Yeah.
demonize her personally. And, but I also definitely do not revere her. I think that a lot of her actions, especially in her neglect and abuse of people that were supposedly in her care, was a symptom of a system that taught her to be
Yeah.
that way and not like a flaw in her character. But at the same time, I don't like revere her as, oh,
It's
Mother
not good.
Teresa's.
Yeah.
No, but I did listen to a podcast in which it was like an exploration of her life because I was curious about it. Like, I want to know more about this woman because I've heard so many conflicting things. I'd like to know more. And one of the things that was really amazing to me was that the first year of her, for lack of a better word, ministry, she felt like God was in her head every moment of the day, instructing her on what to do and how to set up her mission and how to set up her work. But after that first year, she said she never heard God's voice again.
Oh my
So,
God.
yeah, the next, like, what, 60, 70 years of her work,
Wow.
she did not feel that God was present for her.
That's
And like,
so brutal.
it
Like
is, and it's like to,
that's wild.
yeah, and I don't personally revere Mother Teresa as a saint, or I don't even revere a lot of saints as saints, but I don't revere her as a symbol of goodness in the world. I just don't. But a lot of people do. And a lot of people all across the world have held her up as this emblem of, justice and God's work.
Yeah.
And she never felt like God was present for her after that first year. What would that must have been like to have all of that, have millions of people around the world, and including the institution that you work for that guides so much of this world, come at you with that kind of rhetoric and that this is what
God,
you
that's
do for others and
painful.
you don't feel that for yourself. Like,
That's
what that must have been like is just on a human level.
brutal.
Brutal.
It's
Yeah.
brutal.
Brutal is a great
It's
word.
so
Yeah.
awful.
And even then,
That is so
so there's
scary.
there's part of me that's like, then maybe you should have looked at what you were doing and stepped off.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe
yeah,
there's a reason you were alone in that, but
yeah,
also like that's to be a religious figure whose religion who feels like they don't even have their religion is what.
Yeah. It was really finding those kind of pieces there. And so I wanted people to know that in the wake of your loss, having a crisis of faith, questioning your magic, because it's so, I've seen so many incredible things happen, you know, through my journey of witchcraft. And yet when you have a loss, all of a sudden you question every experience you've ever had. Like,
Yeah.
even if it's like the most visceral, for lack of a better word, miraculous thing that has happened, suddenly you're like, but did that even happen in the way that I remember it? Or was that just a
Yeah.
mirage? And that's what I wanted people to give themselves permission to experience. And not everybody's going to have that. I mean, I've even had some people give me feedback since they read the book where they said, well, I haven't had a crisis of faith. And I said, okay, some people
That's
don't
cool.
have,
Yeah.
sometimes they don't. Sometimes when you lose, your faith goes on overdrive. Your experiences are just all of a sudden ramped up, and it's like you're almost consumed by it. That's natural too. But what I felt like was not as commonly discussed in witchcraft community was less about, we're very open about talking about really powerful moments of belief and moments of magic, but we don't talk as much about the moments when the magic seems to have completely gone away from the world. And so I wanted witches to know that that happens. I mean, even if you don't have a loss, it might happen anyway, but definitely loss is fodder for that. And that it's not a problem to solve. And that a lot of us will start to believe again in a different way. For most of us, I mean, not all, everybody's different. And there's some folks
Everybody's different.
there's some folks in the loss that after that, they just may never come back to witchcraft again. It may just, was part of a different chapter, but a lot of us will, but it's going to be different. I was a very deity-centered witch before my loss. I wrote 3 books on goddesses, on Bridget the Morgan and Hecate. And after the loss, I wanted nothing to do with the gods. Even when I started my faith in them, their existence started to return, it was more like, yeah, but I don't want anything to do with them. And now it is, I do keep an altar and I do revere them to a point, but it is not like it was before, where I really believed that they were the architects of what was happening to me, and that they required my devotion. I don't really feel that way anymore. I recognize their role and I recognize their existence, and I also find that my magic personally is a lot more about the land I live on and my ancestors than it ever was before. I'm paying a lot more attention to my dreams, just even on very small things. Like, I had a spirit tell me the other day not to enroll my daughter in a specific school program. And so I started, not because it was anything dangerous. I won't say exactly what they told me, but they were just like, these are the problems you'll have with it if you go that route. And, today at a play group, or I was hearing some other mothers all but say exactly what the spirits had said. In their own different perspective, like, yeah, this is a program that, here's the problems with. I'm like, oh, I already knew that. And whether that's my, innate sense of spidey sense, what have you, or I just believe that I have spirits in the land and ancestors who went and checked out that group and said, yeah, we don't want our kid over there. One of the things I've said about this book was that, if a lot of people liken finding witchcraft, paganism, magic akin to leaving an oppressive society and running off into the woods and forging their own way. And I feel like that's a really accurate analogy for what, or metaphor for what finding witchcraft is like. In the real world, that's all that, some people may decide, I can't live in normal society, I'm going to go live in the woods by myself. Both of those things are all well and good until you fall and break a leg. And I feel like that's what can happen when it comes to, in a spiritual sense, with witchcraft, is that you go off on, you leave the oppressive society and you go off on your own. But when you experience something devastating like loss, you're not necessarily going to have the tools around you that these mainstream religious systems have. And honestly, that's why religions were built in the first place.
Yeah.
They were really built in order to help us come up with practices, systems, support for the existence of being human, which is terrifying and confusing. If that's what they could be, that'd be great. And then, of course, they turn into how to live 101, especially in this country. And it's really, that's a different story.
It becomes a whole other thing.
Because a whole other story. So, and, you know, even with the many shortcomings that some of these, you know, the mainstream faiths might have, they have some systems in place to help someone in their time of grief. Whether or not those systems are good or flawed is a different situation. The systems are there.
They have them, yeah.
And so, and it's also not to say that it's a mistake to leave these faiths and go forge your own way. Just like it's not necessarily a mistake to go hike the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail. People do it all the time. But these people, when they go hiking, they bring provisions with them. They bring supplies. So that if they fall and break a leg, they can tend to their own self until help can come along. Absolutely. And so what I've hopefully offered to, you know, through Sacred Tears is not a system in place, but a bag of elixirs rather. And that if somebody has walked along and you know, somebody else is fallen and they're injured along the way in this experience of life, you know, I'm walking through the woods too, and I've had a similar injury. I've got a bag of elixirs. Let's open it up and try a few of these, and hopefully they'll make you feel better enough, or just to get you back on your feet enough to go find the next bag of elixirs, or give you enough strength to go find your own materials to make your own elixir. So that's what my goal was. I think one of the biggest fears I have about this book, and already I've seen some of it in the reviews. It makes me very sad. One person said on a Goodreads review that they thought this was the book that would save them. And I've never wanted anyone to think that this book would save anyone. And I mentioned that very early in the book, is that you will not agree with me on everything in this book. Not everything in this book will be appropriate for you. My hope is that everyone who picks it up could find one thing in there that helps them enough to get to the next, whatever it is that they need. That's all. Yeah. It's like, if everybody said, I mean, 99% of this book I could do without. I did find one thing on page 86 that I found somewhat helpful. Great. I did my job. You know, obviously it makes me happier when people find that a lot of it is applied to them, and that's great. It's like, good, you found a lot of stuff in there. That's excellent. But my whole goal is that just find one thing in there that can help you just enough to get to the next, whatever it is that you need. Because grief is so unique and subjective. Yeah. You know, we were just talking about like how, you know, what kind of mother each child needs is not necessarily the kind of mother that person naturally is. So you just do the best you can, right? And, you know, that's the same thing with loss. Not every response to grief is going to be what that person needs in that specific loss. Yeah. Right? I mean, there have been times in my life I've been through grief and what I really craved was distraction. And then there's also times when, but especially with my last loss or loss of pregnancy at 12 weeks, there was no distraction. You can't distract. No. There's no.
It's not like you're going to forget that happened. Yeah.
No, you know, and it's not like the needs there were very different. They were different. I didn't need to talk about it. I could barely form words. When I lost my relationship before that, you know, many, many years ago, before I met my husband, that's all I wanted to do was talk about it. I wanted to go out to eat and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. You know,
it's funny how different experiences go that way, but you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. But that may not be, it could be the reverse for someone else, that they lose someone to death and they want to talk about them. And then they, you know, and they crave that distraction.
Yeah, actually, something that was interesting about your book is that you do have, you know, specific little spells and rituals and activities that people can do. But I think what's great about the book is that you're showing the things that helped you. And you leave a lot of room. You leave a lot of room for people to create something like that, but for themselves. I think you give a lot of like good ideas so that someone can create their own spells, their own rituals, their own ways of talking to people about what they need that fit their situation. And I think that the best thing about the book is how relatable it was.
Mhm.
Even though I went through something that's completely different than what you went through, I had such a similar experience with my crisis of faith. Like I'm reading passages in the book. I'm like, this exact sentence played through my mind. Like I said this exact thing out loud. I said this to myself over and over. And it was like, it was weird to, to see it in someone else's book, right? But it was also very helpful. I was like,
Mhm.
this is not something that just happened to me. And the fact that my belief and my practice changed after all of that is it's something that I struggled with. I'm like, is that right? Like, should I just go back to what I was doing? And I just can't. And so I found it very comforting that there's this idea where it's like, no, your relationship to spirituality is just probably going to change a little bit.
Yeah, it is. And having recognizing that, not
Yeah.
what I wouldn't even say expecting it, because some of the changes may be so minute that it would just, people might say it happens anyway. But
Yeah.
recognize, just saying, okay, this is normal, and there's
Yeah.
not something wrong with me, and there's not something wrong with the practice of witchcraft, that I'm now having this changed relationship, and you don't necessarily have to do something about it.
Yeah.
Some people may
It just
find,
needs to be. Yeah, it just is. Like
yeah,
there's
yeah, you may find, like, through your journey, say that for some folks, that they identify as witches, but when they're in grief, they really identified with the Buddhist approach to grieving. Does that mean they need to go start being a practicing Buddhist? Not necessarily.
yeah.
Maybe this is a wake up
Maybe that's a
moment.
good direction to
Yeah,
check
maybe
out.
this is, or maybe this is just, that was a tool, that it was an elixir that a lovely Buddhist writer put out there for you, that you have found very helpful. Maybe it will continue to integrate within your practice. Maybe not.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes there's that pressure of, I need to make this, needs to be, I need to be able to explain this. And as witches, we live in mystery? Don't we live in understanding? Do we really need to explain everything? Do we have to have
Yeah.
a label, a box for it every single time? Some witches really do thrive in structured traditions, and I'm not knocking those. What I want folks to know is that in the wake of grief, your beliefs are likely going to shift, and that's normal,
Yeah.
right? And that they may come back and look very much like they did before. They may not. There may be something in the middle. It's not, it doesn't, I just don't want people to feel like they have to yet have one more task to
Yeah.
complete. Like, I need to make sure I start believing again. I got to get back on my practice again. I've got to, I've got
The
to,
pressure we
the
put
pressure.
ourselves
Yeah. I've got
under
to,
for that.
I'm having these experiences with Lilith, and I'm definitely much more of a Norse person. Maybe I need to start studying Lilith. Well, okay, if studying the myths of Lilith are helpful to you in this time, awesome. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go make a dedication and start a whole new thing.
Yeah.
Maybe right now she's just showing up being like, "Oh, wow, you got a whole lot of something happening. I relate, you know."
Maybe you need a story or two to help you get through this.
Yeah,
It,
she found you while you're in the
yeah.
woods, and she came along and opened her bag of elixirs and was like, "Here, I got something for you." But it's like, "Oh, I have to go devote myself to her now? How is this going to work with my Norse practice?" I don't know.
Maybe it doesn't have to. Yeah, maybe it
Doesn't
doesn't
have
have
to.
to.
Yeah, I just
Maybe
I
we
just
can
want
just
people,
contain multitudes,
yeah,
Let's
just get
just
through
be
this
weird.
time. Get through
Yeah.
this time. You don't have to answer to anything. Is
Yeah.
is also what I want people to understand.
Yeah. I think that's a really important lesson. I know after I went through this horrible experience, I actually found myself more interested in gods. And I think part of the reason is because you ask yourself these questions in the book that I just absolutely had to write down. Um, where is okay, so if witchcraft didn't cause my loss, but witchcraft also couldn't prevent it, was witchcraft even real? What was the point of being a witch if I couldn't control my destiny? And you expressed a similar feeling to the gods, like, um, you know, what is the point of the gods if they can't do anything? If they're not going to intervene in our lives, like, what's the point of worshiping gods? And I felt that way, but, like, about myself. It was
Mm,
like, well, if I can't prevent, all of these things that I was trying to cast spells to prevent, if that's not gonna work, and I also can't dig myself out of this hole with witchcraft, am I actually a witch? Am I doing
right.
anything? Is magic even, like, worth anything at all to me?
Yeah.
And for a long time, the answer to that question was no. I got nothing. Like, I'm drained, I'm tapped out, I don't believe in any of this, I've got nothing. And for whatever reason, um, stories about goddesses were a lot more helpful,
Yeah.
and I think it's for a lot of the reasons you mentioned in here.
One thing we have to remember is that I do believe that gods exist. I do believe that they are cognizant beings. I do not believe for a moment that I have a fucking clue what their agendas are.
Yeah, I got
Um,
nothing.
I don't know. Even if they even have agendas, right? But what I do believe is that they exist because of human experiences, and that collectively over tens of thousands or not millions of years, however long Homo sapiens have had an idea of gods, that we've been giving them our experiences. And that when you read a story of a god or goddess, you're reading a story of what happened to people, right?
Yeah,
So you've got a lot of different traditions that talk about a great flood. Okay. That's an experience
so
that's
many.
so many. That is an experience that's likely tied to the last ice age. Again, another
Yeah,
one of my fantasy PhD theses, dissertations, is that there's probably was a time when there were a lot of floods going on because the glaciers were melting and people didn't
absolutely.
understand what was going on. So they're telling this story, and these stories have lived in people's minds as like there was a great flood. Yeah, if you look through geology, they'll tell you, yep, there were some floods going on, And so, but that's how. So people started to, in many cases, believe that gods were punitive because terrible things were happening.
Right.
Um, Same thing when you look at like Hecate's history, is that, in her early history, goddess, benevolent goddess of fertility and crops. Okay, so we're probably looking at a time which people were living pretty well. There
Things
were
were good.
things were
Yeah.
good. Yeah, so they're doing well. So the gods are nice. And then things shift. Everyone always blames Christianity, is that Christianity put a negative stamp on goddesses in particular, and there is some of that out there. But also you're looking at, okay, maybe there was also disease going on or
Yeah.
warfare that wasn't related to Christianity. Crop failures, different kinds of climate change.
Life
Those
is
were
suffering.
for suffering, yeah. And so all of a sudden the gods are scary and horrible because existence is scary and horrible. And so
Right.
when you look at these stories, it's a story of human existence. The
Yeah.
gods. So it's and that's something that I came to understand and honestly really revere gods and goddesses for, because they do hold a story of humanity. They hold what
Yeah.
our collective experiences are. And some of those experiences are not good. And if these gods are cognizant, I do believe that it's possible to gain wisdom and understanding from them on how to navigate some of these experiences. There's an exercise that I do with the Morgan, where it's not like asking the Morgan to solve things for you, because to me that still comes back to some very Christian rhetoric of like needing a
Yeah.
god or goddess to take care of you, to save you, to fix things for you. At the same time, when you look in myths, the Morgan was a strategist. She had an answer to problems that collectively people were struggling with. So is it possible that, she's had this role, that she's seen a lot of things, she's seen a lot of solutions, she's seen a lot of things go wrong and right? Is it possible to engage with her for her wisdom, just as the way the other gods do within the myth, as they look to the Morgan and say, what say you, Morgan? What do you think? And she gives her perspective. She's like, here's what we need to do, here's what's going to work, and also here's what we need to be prepared for, both good and bad.
Yeah.
So you know so I had actually a really beautiful experience at Mystic South with leading this exercise of what does it look like to take to shift into different guises to approach a challenge, in the way that the Morgan shifted in different guises to approach her own challenge. What does it
Yeah.
look like when you approach a challenge from a different way? Not necessarily come in and like, be a warrior and beat something up, although that is a solution that might work in certain cases, but it's not
And she
it's
had a
not the
great wardrobe, like, just
oh Yes.
Just
She had her eel,
absolutely.
she had the
Yeah.
eel look, she had the heifer look, she had the she-wolf, she had the old lady, she had the
Fabulous.
princess, she had all the stuff. So
That's helpful.
what,
Go for that. Yeah.
oh yeah. So try them all on, see what's working
Yeah.
with you today for this specific event. So that, that's one way that I also approach deity now, is like beacons of human experience, beacons
Yeah.
of potential wisdom. Does that mean they're all knowing and all powerful? No, because there are things that might be coming up for me that they haven't seen before. It's hard to imagine. Or, things coming up for humanity we haven't seen before. That's terrifying to think, but like it's possible to learn from the gods. It's possible to learn from their mistakes and their victories.
Yeah.
And that's what I've started, that helped me with my loss, is that, maybe the gods didn't orchestrate it, and maybe they couldn't prevent it, and maybe they wouldn't even if they could. But I can learn from them. How did they navigate loss? How did the people who revered them navigate loss? What have they
Yeah.
seen people do that's worked? And
Yeah.
how might that help me right now with what I'm going through?
Yeah. How can I be inspired by this energy to help me, work with what's going on in my own life?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something I came to feel about the gods and goddesses too. It's one of those things where it's like, do I know 100% that this is a real like human that can stand before me? I don't know if I do, but I know that there's something about reading this story that it feels very human. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It feels like it's something, like it's an experience that I just had with just a whole bunch of really beautiful poetic language, right? But it's helpful to me to think of the story of humanity, and the story of these gods and these magical beings and of the universe as the same. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
They're all the same kind of thing, just happening in different times and different places in different ways. And if those things could work out in the end and we're all still here, that means my thing can work out in the end and we're all still here, even if it doesn't look the same as it did before. Everything's
Yeah.
going to change.
Yeah.
And it's become a very comforting idea to me, a very comforting thought
Yeah.
that really
And
helped me
and
out.
and I feel like because witches have a lot, especially newer witches, talk a lot about the concept of karma, which comes from the Hindu path. And so, when I've heard, Hindu practitioners describe it, it's very, very different than how,
Mhm.
we typically say karma. You do something and then it happens back to you. That's not really what karma is. And so for me to try to break it down, I would not do it justice. So I'm not going to try. But what I also feel is like that kind of understanding is, something is happening to you because you deserve it. To me, that is still leftover Christian bullshit.
Oh, yeah,
That
for sure.
comes that even a lot of modern progressive Christians don't believe. But it's still like in our, you've done something bad, so you've be punished for it. You didn't honor your ancestors enough, so therefore they didn't help you support your pregnancy. But and then instead of looking at it being like, it's not because I did something wrong, it's that pregnancy loss is part of human reproduction, and it is
Yeah.
incredibly disappointing, devastating, traumatic, whatever you want to call it. When you experience it, it is a natural thing that happens to reproductive bodies. Like it
Yeah.
just does. Are there other things involved that could be, discovered? Sure. We could look at our environment. We could look at, other things that were going on, but it helped me to step aside from that and not go down the, what did I do?
Yeah.
What am I being punished for? What did I do in a past life? Because I don't feel like those kinds of things are helpful.
No.
I don't. I just think that can keep us from getting to the place of recognizing that loss is going to happen to us all in one way or another, and
Yeah.
it's not because we did something bad, right?
Yeah.
I want us to. It's just that's not correct. It's not right, and it doesn't help us to.
Yeah. It's not
But I also,
helpful at all.
yeah, but I also think that it's also natural for us to wonder that too. Like
Yeah.
to have that space where we're like, what happened? I must have done something. And I think that also just comes from that desire to control what
Yeah.
happened. So again, those listening who are having those thoughts in the wake of your loss, that's also not a problem. But I want you to know that that is also a symptom of loss and not a recognition of reality. You know, to
Yeah.
have those questions is natural to have that in loss. It does not mean that those things are real.
That's real, yeah.
Yeah.
Just because we all think those things doesn't mean that that's actually reality. It's an emotional response that it's one of those things. We all wanna find a reason why something happened. We want it to mean something
Yes.
so that it doesn't feel so I don't know, so it doesn't feel like, well, that didn't need to happen, and so, everything's ruined now.
Yeah.
It's, but it's not always you're not always gonna find that. You're not always gonna find an answer to that. You talk about closure in the book, like, sometimes there's just none, and it's so frustrating, but it's unfortunately very frequently the case.
It is really tough. And I also taught a class on this at Mystic South, and one of the learning curves for me in talking about this is recognizing that, first of all, that a lot of closure will never be found. Closure must be created.
Yeah.
And in a recent loss, it's not going to happen no matter what. Like
No.
creating, and because I had a couple of folks in my class doing the exercise and they really had a difficult time. And if I could go back, what I would like to have said is, in the wake of a fresh loss, this exercise is going to be really hard.
Yeah.
It's your life. You want to try it, go for it. I would also, though, just to get that practice on something a little older. Like, let's practice with a high school romance,
Yeah.
just so that you can walk through the steps. But, if you've, because some people in the class had lost people to death that they loved very, very close to them in traumatic ways a month ahead of time.
Yeah.
And the specific exercise I was offering was not going to get them to the next elixir. And I don't know,
Yeah.
I don't know how else to best say it. That wasn't the
Yeah.
elixir they needed in that moment. And when I teach this class again, because I do think there's a lot of good in it, I'm just going to come out and say it, like, y'all do what you want. It's your life. It's your journey. I will say, if you're fresh from a loss, this is going to be a tough exercise, because you've got to have some kind of perspective before you can even think about creating closure. And I feel like that's where the problem with closure is happening, is not the desire for it. It's when we're tripped up on it by believing it's outside of ourselves. Like,
Yeah.
the closure is going to, I use my old romance as an example, because that's the very common one I get from tarot clients, other people wanting to get closure as to why someone left a relationship. Totally get it. But I think the problem is that they expect that closure is going to come from someone else, that they're going to have a coffee shop conversation with them, or they're going to get a letter or an email or a phone call, and that person's going to be very honest with them about why they left, and that answer will be satisfying to the person who
Wouldn't
gets it.
that be lovely?
I mean,
Total fantasy, though. Like,
Quentin Tarantino wrote the most ridiculous scene at the end of Kill Bill 2. Sorry, spoiler alert, folks, where he shot
So
that
good.
truth serum into Uma Thurman's knee. And it was so stupid, but I think it was on purpose. Like, this is a stupid,
satisfying, though.
was
It's like,
satisfying,
wouldn't that
though.
be great? Yeah.
Yeah, but also there was, even then, Bill wasn't quite satisfied with the answer. Like,
He was
if he
never
had
gonna
survived
be
the movie, would
satisfied.
that have been his closure? So it's like, you got to first off have the conversation. Like, with my last relationship, I was heartbroken. It was one of those losses that makes you rethink the entire world, including my relationship with the gods. And I've never seen or spoken to this person again. So I won't. That's just it. We've made this decision. We're not going to talk again. So I'm not going to have a coffee shop conversation with him.
Yeah.
And there was a long time that bothered me, because I had some questions I wanted answered. But then I also realized, like, even if I were to have that coffee shop conversation, would he be honest? And if he were honest, would I believe him? Right.
Yeah.
And even if I did believe him, would I be satisfied with what I heard? And
Would
the
it
truth
actually make a difference?
would it make a difference? And it's still, even if all of those pieces had come into play, I'd had the coffee shop moment. He told me the honest truth. It was a truth, that it was something that I believed. I would still have to choose to make that my closure. I would still have to choose to accept that. So instead of going through all those steps of getting the person to tell you the truth, or getting the doctor to go do some major research with the Mayo Clinic and give you the reason why this person died, and they can give you every answer that you've asked for, you still have to choose to accept that answer.
Yeah.
Right. And I also want to say that it is very comforting to folks when they do get, especially when it comes to a medical thing or a thing related to crime, that they have more information about why or what happened. That can be, it's a huge part of closure. I want to make that very, very clear. But still, it doesn't matter how it comes. We still have to choose our closure. And a lot of times we don't get our answers. So is there a point in which we can create our own closure and choose and say, my story is beautiful. My story has value, even if there were no reason for it. Even if there were no reason for my loss, my story still has value. It is still a beautiful story. And that's the story of creating a story. Like, I have people write their loss as a myth without a moral of the story, not because and therefore the knight, because he was captured by the Snow Queen, that's why he didn't come back. It's just the knight left. And we don't know why.
Yeah.
We don't know where he went. And so, just see that your story is beautiful without a moral of the story. And there were some challenges because people were not at the place where they could see any beauty in their story. And that's where it's like, I want to say that going forward when I teach this, and share this exercise with fresh losses, you may not be at a point to do this. So, but that is, I think after a time when loss is no longer fresh and we're further on down our journey and we start seeking the closure, we put us ourselves in a long route. And sometimes we can really keep us dog paddling for a long time or treading water for a long time when we really believe that somebody else is the key to our closure. We are the key to our closure.
Yeah.
Someone else, it may be helpful to finally get some kind of information from someone else, but ultimately it's still going to be us that chooses to use that information as the closure. So instead of waiting for it to come from outside ourselves, do what we can to create it within ourselves. And then if we can still get that information from the outside, even better. Yay, if that helps. So,
yeah, it's a great tool if you can get it. If you can't,
it's great if you can get it, but you still have to use it.
Hope. Yeah,
you still
but
have
it's not
to
like
choose.
There's no hope if you don't get it.
Yeah,
and I think that's I think when we talk about letting go or letting things go, I think people have this expectation oh, I'm going to let it go and it's never going to come up again. It's going to be gone forever, and that's just not it. That's just that's just not it. Even with closure, something's not going to cease to exist. It's not going to disappear from your memory just because. It's not like it's never ever going to hurt ever again. That's just not how emotions work. That's not how our brains work. It's
and
just
also
one of those things where it's you have to letting go, you kind of have to adjust your expectations when it comes to letting go. It's letting go is still not this magic pill that's going to make everything okay. It's
And
still
letting go is
it's
also
still
deeply,
tricky.
letting go is deeply subjective. That's something we explored
Yeah.
in my my virtual platform where I work with people who are looking to lead more magically minded lives. And that letting go, there is no objective definition of what letting go is.
There's no definition.
No, and I think people are so quick to rush to you just need to let it go. Okay, what does letting go mean? Does letting go mean that you are no longer ruminating on it? Does letting go mean you're no longer angry about it? Does letting go mean that you are at peace with what happened? Are you ultimately happy about what happened? What does letting go mean? So it's just kind of, it's very dismissive when people say, well, you just let it go.
Yeah.
Well, letting go doesn't mean the same thing to everyone.
No, and it really doesn't. And I definitely screamed the question, what the fuck does that mean, to a doctor in the psych ward? And even she was like, I don't know. You'll
Mm-hmm.
you'll figure it out eventually. And I'm like, I fucking hate that answer. But that's and she's the doctor. She's the psychologist in the psych ward, and that's the only answer she's got. That's the answer. The
Mm-hmm.
answer is I don't know. There's no rule book, there's no list of instructions. I can't even tell you when you've gotten there. So don't put the pressure on
Yeah.
yourself so much, because it's just you'll know when you get there, and that's just gonna have to be okay.
Closure itself is fluid. Like,
Yeah,
to get to a place where there's the sense of, I mean, I have, um, you know, I, like, there are times when you can, I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book was, having lost some friends in high school in a car accident. Um, that my closure about their loss has changed a lot. And sometimes I have different entry points to closure. There's been a journey of one, the closure where I no longer cry because I miss them. Right. But then there are times when I've had to gone through a process of closure of not me and my friends not having the support we honestly needed from the
yeah,
adults in our lives, and having some anger around that, and then having to create my closure there, because having a conversation about that with some of these adults might have been helpful, but it also could have caused a lot more harm than good.
yeah.
So I had to create my own closure that way. And sometimes there's still some kinds of, one of the pieces that I still battle with periodically, and I don't know that there's going to be closure there, was what kind of lives they could have lived, and what would the world be like if they were still in it.
Yeah.
What kinds of, I mean, just to be super morbid, Seth MacFarlane was supposed to be on one of the planes that hit one of the twin towers, and
So weird.
he missed his flight that day.
Yeah.
If he caught the flight, we would have no Family Guy.
And then all of the other things that came
Yes.
from that, like, even if you're not like a Family Guy watcher, like, that has affected pop culture in such a profound way that it's like,
Right.
how different would things be?
If he had been
there
on
was a whole other possible future that just no longer
exists. And
exists.
so what about those other people that were on the plane?
Yeah,
What would the world be like if all those people had finished their natural lives and
yeah,
done things? And not necessarily all of them are going to create a hit cartoon series. They don't have to, but whether they have kids or run for mayor or you know be school teachers, write a novel. I mean, all these
yeah,
does. And so I think about that a lot with those friends that passed away, is that we don't know what the world would have been like if they'd been able to live their whole natural lives. And that
yeah.
I still struggle with. And but then also I think the closure that I have in there is, that's not an unusual thing. A life that's been taken too soon is a tragedy that has continued to happen to humans for all time.
For
And
all time.
so that's where I find my closure. But that closure, that kind of stuff shifts around too.
Yeah. And it's not like pain doesn't exist anymore in
Right.
relation to that event. It's just, it's different. It's just different. It changes. It's not, even when you close the door, it can open back up. Like, it's not permanent. It's one of those things where you kind of have to, there has to be a good reason to open it and to keep it closed. And context really matters with all of that stuff. Um, Something that you just brought up that was, that I really wanted to talk a little bit more about was, you were talking about when your friends passed away, um, that you and your other friends, you needed support from the grown-ups, the other people in your life. You needed support that someone with experience hopefully would have been able to give to you, and you didn't get that, and that was a big part of the problem. And I think that that is something that is really difficult for all of us, is to know how to support somebody, how you can help out or even just not make it worse when someone is grieving. And where I thought about that a lot throughout the book is, you're talking about pregnancy loss and issues of infertility. And I just kept thinking, Jesus, witchcraft is so filled with fertility talk. Like, we talk about physical fertility and we talk about the womb all the time and we talk about periods. And there's just this whole um, like aspect to witchcraft that is very tied up in birth. And I can't imagine what I can't imagine what it's like to read all of that stuff, as someone who A, has kids, or B, has experienced a pregnancy loss. Um, and I just wanted to know how other witches can be mindful about avoiding, kind of unconsciously even, hurting other people who are secretly going through issues like that without, I don't know, without abandoning something that maybe is very important to their practice.
I think that where it's really important is to be, recognizing the complexity of fertility. And you can see, again, going back to what stories are about the gods, and that fertility goddesses were not just beacons of passing out bread.
Yeah.
Fertility goddesses were very, very often related to death, because fertility is a complicated, mysterious, and sometimes deadly process. And that things about fertility in general are not cut and dried. And fertility doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. Think deeper about, what does it mean when you say fertility goddess? What are you actually giving thanks for? That's what I just want people to encourage, instead of just labeling fertility. Fertility equals good and giving, and to quote Dan Savage, good, giving, and game. That is not the case in everything that's related to fertility, whether it's having babies or being able to grow, like having access to food. And recognizing the shadow, or the painful attributes of fertility, the flaky nature of fertility. And that's not just in reproduction of humans, but
In
in
general.
everything. Yeah.
A lot of newer witches were trying to, we're trying to back off a little bit from talking too much about like wombs and birthing humans and womanhood in that way.
I mean, to me, it's
That's
like
all right.
making space to explore, what does fertility mean to people.
I think that's a good thing. I think that's the right way to do it, is that I think instead of just going, axe fertility talk, we're never going to talk about this again. I think instead talking about what fertility means, um, especially in relation to witchcraft, I think branching out is a good idea. Thank you so much for coming on the show today to talk to me. I really appreciate you making the time, um and I appreciate the book. If you like this discussion with Courtney, you should, of course, pick up a copy of Sacred Tears, which is out now. You can also listen to that Witch Life podcast, and in October, you can attend the So Mote That Con. So this is a virtual conference that they do every year, all about being a modern witch in today's world. And it always features really great guest speakers and workshops. So Courtney will be teaching a workshop about Hecate and the journey towards healing. And then you've got some other speakers like Laura Tempest-Zakroff is talking about sigil witchery, and San Elias is talking about uncrossing. Plus a few others that sound really cool. I think Mara Starling is going to be there to talk about Welsh fairies. That's really neat. The keynote speakers are author Matt Oren and Rachel True, who you may remember as Rochelle in The Craft. And they are both very experienced psychic witches, so I imagine that will be very interesting. And one workshop that sounds so cool to me is The Dancing Witch, an introduction to movement in your craft by, and I'm going to butcher it, I'm so sorry, you guys know my love-hate relationship with French, by Lulu La Duchesse de Rière, a Canadian burlesque dancer. She actually won Miss Exotic World in 2022, and she was the first Canadian and Indigenous person to be crowned the Queen of Burlesque in New Orleans in 2018. Big fan of the combination of like sex and camp that you can really only get from like good burlesque dancing. So I think that'll be a really super cool workshop. There's also raffles and giveaways and live rituals and Q&As. That rhymed. I'm very excited about it. So check out thatwitchlife.com for tickets, and I would hurry up because you'll still be getting the early bird price until about September 30th. So check that out. My hope is, of course, that none of you are spending the autumn equinox from deep inside a grief spiral. But if you are, just know that you're not alone. And it's not going to feel exactly like it does now forever. It's a cycle. A season of growth and abundance is ending. The days are getting darker. The temperature might drop. But eventually, everything is going to grow again in a new way or time or place. And that could be just as beautiful as the time before. Autumn also does have its own particular brand of beauty, even if it's not quite the same. So I hope you have a holiday that fills your hearts and your bellies in whatever way that you most need, and that you'll join me again in the next episode of the Fat Feminist Witch Podcast. If you want to learn more about me and the show, buy copies of my books, and get recommendations for new witchy books and decks for yourself, check out thefatfeministwitch.ca. I could not do the show at all without the support of my generous friends and followers on Patreon. They provide me with so much support, and I don't just mean financial. Also, they bring me lots of inspiration, and they really root me on all the time. I'm forever grateful to them. So there's my little bit of gratitude for the Autumn Equinox. If you want to pitch in and also get some extra content every month, like magical updates and posts and newsletters. And we also have a book club that runs every month. So you can find that at the patreon.com/thefatfeministwitch. I also have merch, tote bags, stickers, coffee cups, and of course t-shirts, which go up to size 5X on my TeePublic shop. And finally, you can track me down on Facebook, Instagram, or Threads, where I can get a little bit more personal and really interact with you guys, answer some questions. I love that. So links to all of these avenues of connection can be found down in the description box below.